Welcome to today's Explainer. Man, we have got an absolutely chaotic news cycle to untangle today. Between all the wild market fluctuations and these massive shifting global policies, it honestly feels like we're standing right in the middle of a giant weather event. So today, we're going to use a storm metaphor to help make sense of it all. We'll be looking at these massive global economic shifts, and most importantly, we are going to connect them directly to you, your personal life, your wallet, and your well-being.
Here's our roadmap for the storm. First, Phase 1, the midweek macro storm. Then, Phase 2, betting big on AI. Next, Phase 3, global trade and tensions. And finally, Phase 4, impacts close to home. Let's get right into it.
Phase 1, the midweek macro storm, market turbulence, and the Federal Reserve. Okay, let's dive right in. The phrase midweek macro storm actually comes directly from Wall Street Journal reporter Paul LaMonica. And honestly, it perfectly captures the sheer confluence of major events we are seeing right now. We're looking at a massive collision: tech earnings, Federal Reserve interest rate decisions, and rising global tensions, all hitting at the exact same time. And the very first lightning strike of this storm? Well, it was actually triggered by rumors that OpenAI missed its revenue and user targets. Because of those OpenAI concerns, the entire tech sector just kind of spiraled. After closing at record highs on Monday, things slipped. The Dow Jones dropped 31 points, so that's 0.1%. The S&P 500 was off by 0.5%, and the tech-heavy Nasdaq fell by nearly a full percent. And get this dip happened right before 4 of the Magnificent 7 companies were set to announce their earnings. It just goes to show you exactly how jittery the market is right now. Now, if that tech sell-off was the lightning, the Federal Reserve is the eye of the storm. Jerome Powell has served as Fed chair since 2018, and his term in that specific role ends on May 15, 2026. President Trump has nominated Kevin Warsh to fill that spot, and the path for Warsh actually just cleared up because the Department of Justice closed its criminal probe into the Fed's headquarters renovation project, handing it over to the Inspector General instead. But here is the massive question mark. Powell's term as a Fed governor doesn't actually expire until January 2028. So, does Powell step away from the Fed completely and leave it in Warsh's hands? Or will he break with tradition and stick around until the Inspector General's inquiry is totally wrapped up? I gotta say, I absolutely love how the source material framed this dilemma. They quoted the legendary band The Clash, singing, "If I go, there will be trouble, and if I stay, it will be double." Seriously, it is the absolute perfect musical summary of the uncertainty gripping the central bank right now.
Phase 2, betting big on AI. The trillion-dollar hype machine.
What is truly mind-blowing here is the sheer concentration of capital. We're calling artificial intelligence the high-pressure center of our market storm, and for a really good reason. AI-linked companies, so we're talking hyperscalers, chip makers, power providers, they now make up roughly 45% of the entire U.S. stock market. You heard that right. Almost half of the market's total weight is tethered to this single explosive sector. Just to put that into absolute terms, $22 trillion. That was the collective value of the Magnificent 7 just the other day. 22 trillion. Let that sink in for a second. That equals the value of all developed stock markets outside the US combined. It's just a staggering, almost unimaginable amount of wealth centralized in just a handful of tech behemoths. So, let's unpack how this builds into a very real systemic risk. We've got these mega AI IPOs approaching fast. OpenAI, Anthropic, Elon Musk's xAI. But why are they in such a rush to go public? Well, the reality is their capital expenditure binges are just too massive for private investors to sustain on their own anymore. They need the cash of retail investors, everyday mom-and-pop investors, before the public's infatuation with AI peaks. And the risk here is enormous. Data from the University of Florida shows us that historically, unprofitable companies going public typically yield negative long-term returns. Plus, because these AI giants' finances are so deeply intertwined with the rest of big tech, even a tiny stumble here could trigger a massive systemic shock. And we're actually seeing the ripple effects of this AI cash grab in the physical world too. Right in Manhattan, cash-rich AI startups are fueling this wild commercial real estate boom. They're renting these incredibly flashy office spaces in highly desirable neighborhoods like Soho and Nomad. But here's the catch, and it's kind of wild. These offices are mostly empty. These startups are literally just securing prime real estate to establish credibility with clients, even if they only have a handful of local employees right now. The whole thing is built entirely on the projection of future growth. Phase 3, global trade and tensions, shifting fronts and market impacts. let's zoom out to the global weather patterns affecting international trade because the geopolitical fronts are incredibly turbulent right now. First off, the United Arab Emirates just announced its departure from OPEC and OPEC+. This is a huge blow to the group's ability to control global oil prices, and as a direct result, international Brent crude prices surged to roughly $110 per barrel. At the exact same time, U.S. officials report that President Trump has instructed aides to prepare for an extended blockade of Iran. The stated goal here is to target the regime's coffers and compel a nuclear capitulation from Tehran. So we've got major global shifts happening simultaneously. And right in our own backyard, there is another really fascinating trade dynamic unfolding. High-tech, super affordable Chinese car brands are currently banned from the American market. But get this, just 5 miles from the U.S. border in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, they are on sale, and they are definitely turning heads. Because federal regulations allow Mexican residents and dual citizens to drive their cars into the U.S., Americans in places like El Paso are getting a first-hand look at these really impressive vehicles. Automotive executives are actually warning that without a clear plan, this cross-border visibility poses a massive long-term threat to the $1.3 trillion U.S. auto industry. Phase 4. Impacts close to home. How the macro hits the micro. So what does this actually mean for you? Let's bring this storm right down to ground level, starting with your own home. The old rules of home insurance, they're being entirely rewritten. It used to be that coastal states bore the brunt of high premiums because of hurricanes. Well, not anymore. Natural disasters like hailstorms, wildfires, and high winds are now hammering inland areas that were previously considered safe. The data literally shows that simply crossing a single county line can now more than double your home insurance premium. Nowhere is truly shielded from the macroeconomic impact of a changing climate map. Moving from your wallet to your well-being, the data reveals a truly surprising disparity when it comes to marital status and cancer risk. For men who have never married, their cancer rates are 68% higher compared to married men. And for never married women, the gap is even starker, an 83% higher risk compared to their married counterparts. But we really need to add some nuance to this data to understand exactly why. It isn't magic. It comes down to behavior and economics. The study points out that unmarried men have 5 times the rate of anal cancer, and unmarried women have 3 times the rate of cervical cancer. Both of these are heavily linked to HPV exposure and differences in preventative screenings. Researchers note that married individuals generally benefit from greater economic stability, better support systems, and just healthier behaviors overall, like lower rates of smoking and alcohol use. They're simply more likely to engage in the preventative care that catches these risks early. Now let's talk about everyday financial anxiety with a very specific number, $12,000. That is exactly how much one seasoned traveler recently lost to a highly sophisticated travel scam. After getting a totally legitimate email about a flight schedule change, he Googled Lufthansa's customer service number. But unfortunately, he called a fraudulent agency posing as the airline. They charged him $12,000 for new tickets, and then completely vanished. With global tensions, like what we just talked about in Iran, potentially causing a flood of flight schedule changes this summer, this kind of macro disruption provides the perfect cover for micro-level scams targeting your wallet.
Finally, I want to offer you a slightly absurd palate cleanser to show just how wild regulations can get. Over in England, there's currently a tiny window epidemic in new building developments. Why, you ask? Well, guidance from the British Standards Institution states that windows in any new building must safely accommodate the reach of 95% of the adult population. And yes, that explicitly includes small, elderly women. As a result, architects are literally being forced to design what critics are calling ugly, ill-proportioned, prison-like windows, simply to ensure that almost everyone can reach the latch.
Which brings us to our final thought for today's explainer. We've looked at sweeping geopolitical shifts, fluctuating home insurance, and an incredibly concentrated $22 trillion AI sector that's practically propping up our markets. So the question I'll leave you with is this. Is this AI bubble actually built with a structural integrity to withstand the massive macro storm we are currently in? Or, when the retail cash finally runs out, will it shatter just as easily as one of those tiny British windows? Thank you so much for joining me today. Keep your eyes on the data, stay curious, and I will see you in the next explainer.